Iran says it will block snap inspections by UN nuclear experts from next week if other parties of the 2015 deal fail to uphold their obligations. The Foreign Ministry spokesman, Saeed Khatibzadeh, said the decision would still be reversible if others complied with the agreement.
President Biden has signed an executive order to identify and fix weaknesses in the supply chain for critical items like pharmaceuticals, vehicle batteries, rare minerals, and semiconductors. Mr. Biden said the U.S. should not have to rely on a foreign country during a national emergency.
The bottom line is simple. The American people should never face shortages in the goods and services they rely on. And remember, the shortages in PPE during the pandemic, that meant we didn't have masks. We didn't have gowns or gloves to protect our frontline healthcare workers. That should have never happened, and this will never happen again in the United States, period.
The review will look for ways to avoid future shortages by boosting domestic production and strengthening ties with allies. The Australian Parliament has passed landmark legislation that will require big tech giants such as Facebook and Google to pay media companies for the news content shown on their platforms. Shaima Khalil is in Sydney.
The News Media Bargaining Code had been fiercely opposed by the US tech giants long before it passed. Last week, Facebook blocked all news content to Australians over the standoff, but then reversed the decision after negotiations with the government. The law passed with new amendments, which would make it possible for Facebook and Google not to be subject to the code in some cases. However, both companies have now made lucrative private deals with some big Australian publishers, which has been widely viewed as a compromise. Australia's law is seen as a test case for similar regulation in other countries to get payment from digital platforms for news.
The UN Security Council has unanimously approved a resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire in armed conflicts across the world so that COVID-19 vaccines can be delivered. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale reports.
Under the plan drafted by British diplomats, UN envoys will try to persuade warring parties it is in their interest to reduce local infection rates. The government fears that without ceasefires, about 160 million people could be excluded from vaccinations, and that could allow new variants to emerge. Crucially, the Security Council also agreed to take further measures if armed groups choose to block vaccinations. The resolution took just a few weeks to agree and will be seen as a win for British diplomacy. The test will be whether it works on the ground.
The United Nations says the security forces in Myanmar have killed at least 18 protesters in their bloodiest attempt yet to end demonstrations against the military coup. The UN Human Rights Office said it had credible evidence that more than 30 people had been wounded in nationwide protests. Widespread posts on social media showed unarmed people lying motionless and protesters bleeding after they were confronted with live ammunition, rubber bullets, stun guns and water cannon. The head of the UN agency in Myanmar, James Rodehaver, condemned the violence used against peaceful protesters.
What the actions of today show is that there was a decision taken to start using force, deadly force, because you have suddenly protests where the police had acted with at least some degree of restraint. They had resorted to the use of force in previous days. There had been sporadic use of live rounds, but today suddenly in many locations you have the use of deadly force, and we see the results.
Donald Trump has used his first major political speech since his tumultuous departure from the White House to position himself as a prospective Republican presidential candidate in 2024. Mr. Trump excoriated the new administration, saying President Biden had had the most disastrous first month in presidential history. David Willis was listening to Mr. Trump's speech.
If anybody was in any doubt about whether or not Donald Trump is tending to go away quietly, as it were, they have the answer. He did say he's not planning to form a political party of his own, but he would be leading the Republican Party to victory, he said. Donald Trump said there are a lot of people who still supported his Make America Great Again message, and he called it a movement, in fact, and he said that great things lie ahead for that movement.
A group of 8 teenagers from across Australia are beginning a class action lawsuit against a proposed coal mine extension in the state of New South Wales. They want the government to prevent the work at Whitehaven Coal's Vickery mine. More from Phil Mercer.
The teenage plaintiffs insist that Australia's Environment Minister has a duty of care to protect them from global warming. They argue the expansion of a coal mine in the state of New South Wales will exacerbate climate change and harm their future. The class action could set a precedent that stops Australia approving new fossil fuel projects. The coal mining company has said the teenagers' case has no merit and should be dismissed. The minister has agreed not to make a final decision until the trial is over.
The Brazilian Health Ministry says it's registered 1,641 coronavirus deaths in the past 24 hours, the highest number since the pandemic began. Nearly 260,000 Brazilians have died. With the latest for us, here's Katie Watson.
In a week where scientists and health workers have been sounding alarm bells over the deteriorating situation in Brazil, these numbers perhaps come as no surprise. Now, at its worst point in the pandemic, in some parts of Brazil, hospitals have run out of intensive care beds. The country's health secretaries earlier this week called for tougher measures to be introduced across Brazil to avoid a wider collapse of the health system.
The US House of Representatives has passed a police reform bill named after George Floyd, the African-American man whose killing by police last year sparked nationwide protests. The legislation would ban chokeholds and end racial profiling. The Democratic House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, said the bill would bring about positive changes within policing.
We're proud of this legislation, which will transform the culture with bold, unprecedented reforms. It will not erase centuries of systemic racism and excessive policing, and it will not bring back George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, say her name, Breonna Taylor, or the countless others who have been killed or harmed. But it will take a tremendous step forward to stop the violence, stem the suffering, and start to build a better America.
The bill must still be approved by the Senate.